The Dawn of the Steppe, written by Second Hogo. The steppe was endless. It was a sea without water, a vast trembling ocean of grass, whose waves rose and fell under the breath of the wind. Above it stretched the eternal blue sky, vast and pitiless, a dome of steel that judged every creature that crawled below. In this land of immensity, to live was to endure hunger, to defy cold, and to measure oneself daily against the cruelty of the earth. It was here, in a place that offered nothing, yet demanded everything, that a boy named Temüjin first opened his eyes to the world. His father, Yesugei, was a chieftain, not mighty among the great tribes, yet strong enough to command loyalty, to win wives, to keep enemies at bay. His mother, Hoelun, was fierce and proud, a woman stolen in youth from another clan, who bore her fate as the sky bears the clouds. Temüjin was scarcely 9 when fate's hammer struck. His father, while returning from arranging a marriage alliance for his son, accepted food and drink from a rival clan. Poison worked its silent law, and Yesugei returned to his tent only to die in torment. In that single hour, the household became bereft not only of a father, but of protection, for the clans of the steppe are loyal only to power. When power vanishes, oaths turn to dust. The people who had sworn to follow Yesugei turned their backs. They drove away his widow and her children, leaving them to the mercies of wolves and hunger. Thus the family, stripped of their herds, abandoned of allies, stood alone upon the barren plain. Hoelu was left with 7 children, each too young to bear the weight of survival. But she was iron. With hands cracked by frost, she gathered roots, tore bark from trees, set traps for fish, and forced her brood to chew the leather of saddles softened in boiling water. She scolded them, she struck them, she wept in secret, but she never yielded. The nights were long and terrible. Wolves prowled around their camp, eyes glowing red in the firelight. The wind howled as though the sky itself were mourning. The children huddled together, shivering beneath thin furs. And in the middle of it all stood Temüjin, thin as a reed, fierce as a hawk, watching the horizon with eyes that seemed older than his years. He learned early that pity had no place on the steppe. Hunger taught cruelty. His half-brother Bekter, older, stronger, hoarded food while the others starved. One day, Temüjin and his full brother Kassar rose against him. Temüjin's arrow struck Bekter down. The boy, scarcely taller than his bow, stained his hands with fraternal blood. From that day, he bore upon his soul a mark darker than hunger, the knowledge that life itself demanded violence. Yet not all was darkness. Among the hills, under the wide sky, Temüjin sometimes met with children of neighboring clans. One of them was Berte, promised to him in betrothal by his father. She was no delicate flower. She was strong, her laughter sharp as a hawk's cry, her eyes deep as the wells of the steppe. In her presence, the orphan boy felt something beyond survival, a trembling warmth, the strange promise of a gentleness that the land itself denied. Berte became his secret star, a memory to hold against the night. Still, the years were cruel. He and his brothers hunted marmots, raided nests for eggs, stole scraps from travelers, and endured scorn from richer tribes. The name Temüjin, given at birth after a captive warrior, was spoken by many with derision. The beggar, they called him, the orphan with empty hands. But he carried in his gaze the spark of destiny. He learned the bow until the string tore his fingers, the horse until the saddle bruised his bones, the sword until his arm quivered from weight. He learned to read the clouds, to smell the snow, to hear the distant thunder of hooves. He learned that every man on the steppe was both hunter and hunted. As he grew to youth, Temüjin found companions, young men as desperate as himself, with no herds, no legacy, only hunger and the fury of survival. To them, he spoke with a voice that carried more than mere words. He spoke of order, of loyalty, of a future where men would not betray their chieftain for a single bowl of milk. Still, the years were cruel. He and his brothers hunted marmots, raided nests for eggs, stole scraps from travelers, and endured scorn from richer tribes. The name Temüjin, given at birth after a captive warrior, was spoken by many with derision. The beggar, they called him, the orphan with empty hands. But he carried in his gaze the spark of destiny. He learned the bow until the string tore his fingers, the horse until the saddle bruised his bones, the sword until his arm quivered from weight. He learned to read the clouds, to smell the snow, to hear the distant thunder of hooves. He learned that every man on the steppe was both hunter and hunted. As he grew to youth, Temüjin found companions, young men as desperate as himself, with no herds, no legacy, only hunger and the fury of survival. To them, he spoke with a voice that carried more than mere words. He spoke of order, of loyalty, of a future where men would not betray their chieftain for a single bowl of milk. One among these was Jamuka, of noble blood, whose spirit burned with the same restless fire. Together they swore the oath of Onda, blood brothers. Cutting their skin, mingling their blood, they declared themselves one soul in two bodies. The stars above bore witness, and the wolves howled as though the sky itself had recorded the vow. In that moment, the orphan boy had found not only a friend, but the mirror of his ambition. But destiny, like the wind, does not flow straight. For a time, Temüjin tasted victory. With a handful of men, he struck at rivals, reclaimed flocks, lifted the banner of 9 yak-tails, and called upon the scattered to gather. His mother, who had once fed her children with bark, now watched him with eyes both proud and fearful. Berta, now his wife, stood by his side, her voice steady, her presence his anchor. Yet the steppe is a land of shifting shadows. The clans muttered, the rivals plotted, and even Jamuka, brother of his blood, would in time become his fiercest enemy. The horizon darkened, the wolves gathered, the storm of betrayal began to stir. The steppe tests all men, but it tests most cruelly the one who dares to rise above others. As Temüjin's name began to echo among the tribes, small at first, like the crack of distant thunder, envy and suspicion grew with it. For the nomads are quick to scorn, and quicker still to betray. Jamuka, his blood brother, his sworn Onda, rode at his side during those first campaigns. Together they raided rival bands, seized horses, reclaimed herds, and for a brief shining moment the dream of unity seemed less a dream than a dawn rising over the grasslands. Jamuka was eloquent, generous, magnificent. Temüjin was stern, severe, inexorable. Where Jamuka gave feasts, Temüjin gave laws. Where Jamuka promised glory, Temüjin demanded discipline. Their friendship was a bowstring, pulled taut between two wills. It was in those days that Temüjin, in his harsh voice, proclaimed a simple creed. No man should be abandoned. In a land where clans discarded widows and orphans as one discards bones to the wolves, this was revolutionary. The lowest herdsman, the humblest archer, felt his worth under Temüjin's gaze. He divided spoils not by lineage but by service, rewarding loyalty with justice that was cold but fair.
The tribes murmured at such order. Some mocked him. What is an orphan to speak of law? But others, weary of chaos, weary of treachery, gathered beneath his banner of 9 yak-tails. It was not silk, it was not gold, but it fluttered in the wind like the breath of heaven itself. Then came the blow of fate that would seal his path forever. Berta, his beloved wife, the one gentle star in his storm-ridden sky, was seized in a raid by the Merkit clan. They came swift as hawks, snatching her from her tent, carrying her into the night. For Temüjin, it was as though the sky itself had fallen.
He who had endured hunger, betrayal, and scorn with iron steadiness now felt his heart shatter. He rode like a man possessed, gathering what allies he could, his brothers, his companions, and Jamuka beside him. With a fury that seemed carved from the eternal blue sky, they struck at the Merkits. The battle was savage, the steppe running red, cries mingling with the storm of hooves. Temüjin carved through men as though carving through fate itself. And when at last Berte was restored to him, pale and silent but alive, he swore before heaven that never again would his family, his people, or his dream be torn from him. From that night his resolve hardened into steel. Yet fate is a serpent. Jamuka, though still smiling, began to feel the sting of envy. His men whispered, "Temüjin commands more loyalty than you. His followers call him Khan, not you." Jamuka, who had once clasped his hand in brotherhood, began to weigh the sweetness of betrayal. The split came sudden as lightning. Jamuka, once friend, now rival, declared himself Gur-Khan, Supreme Khan, claiming 30,000 warriors. Temüjin, with scarcely half that number, stood against him. Blood brother faced blood brother, oath clashing with ambition, friendship torn upon the wheel of destiny. The battle that followed was a tempest of iron. Arrows blotted out the sun, horses screamed, men fell beneath the thunder of hooves. Temüjin fought like a man possessed, his eyes burning with the fire of the sky, but numbers crushed him. Jamuka triumphed, and in triumph he showed his soul. He captured 70 young men of Temüjin's following and slew them with boiling water. The steppe reeled at such cruelty. Men whispered that Jamuka was cursed, that the eternal blue sky would not forgive. Temüjin, though beaten, though scarred, though left with nothing but a handful of loyal companions, bore his defeat in silence. Yet in his silence was iron. He retreated, not broken, but tempered, like steel withdrawn from the forge to grow harder still. In those dark years of exile, Temüjin became more than a warrior. He became a lawgiver, a commander, a man who could turn loss into destiny. He drew to himself those who had nothing, those cast aside by tribes swollen with arrogance. He spoke not of bloodlines, but of brotherhood. To the shepherd he said, "You are equal in my sight to the son of a chieftain." To the orphan he said, "I too was an orphan." The steppe had never heard such words, and slowly, like rivers joining to form a flood, men began to gather. Temüjin raised his banner once more. This time it did not tremble. Beneath it stood men who would follow him not for feasts, not for promises, but for faith. They believed that he was chosen of the sky, that his will was the wind, his word the thunder. He drilled them with discipline unknown among nomads. He divided them into tens, hundreds, thousands, each obeying the voice above them as though it were the command of heaven. The orphan of the steppe was no longer merely a youth clinging to survival. He had become a leader, a storm, a shadow stretching across the horizon. And the clans, watching, whispered his name with awe and fear. Temüjin. The horizon of the steppe was wide, but the heart of Temüjin had grown wider still. Defeat had burned him, exile had hardened him, and yet from the ashes he rose anew, more terrible, more inexorable, more vast than before. Where Jamuka had scattered cruelty like seed, Temüjin began to sow justice. Justice severe as winter, yet steady as the sky. He gathered his followers not by gift of feasts, not by the bribes of stolen herds, but by the promise of order. The steppe, torn for centuries by feud and vengeance, had known only the tyranny of bloodlines. Temüjin struck at that ancient root. He proclaimed that a man should be honored not for his birth, but for his merit. that the son of a shepherd could rise to command, that loyalty was the only nobility. The old chieftains sneered. They called him arrogant, lawless, an orphan daring to overturn the order of ancestors. Yet their laughter masked fear, for his camp grew each day. Men who had known betrayal, widows cast out by tribes, orphans abandoned to wolves, all found in Temüjin a protector, and in his word a law more solid than stone. He divided his warriors into Arban, tens, Zun, hundreds, Mingan, thousands, each unit bound not by kinship but by command. In this new order, chaos itself began to bow. The discipline was fierce. A warrior who stole from his brother was slain. A man who betrayed his unit was cut down without mercy. Yet alongside terror was fairness. When spoils were taken, Temüjin himself ensured that the poorest received their share. The men began to whisper, "He is the father of the orphan, the protector of the widow." This strange justice bound hearts to him as chains never could. Borte, his wife, walked among his tents with quiet dignity. Though scarred by the cruelty of her capture, she never faltered. She carried herself like the queen of a realm not yet born. To the women of the camp she spoke gently. To the men she was a silent reminder that their Khan was more than iron. He was also husband, father, human. At night, Temüjin would look upon her, and in her eyes he saw not the fragile girl of his youth, but a companion tempered as he was by fire. Together they bore children. Together they bore the burden of destiny. Yet destiny is never patient. The tribes still circled him like wolves. Some offered allegiance, then betrayed it. Others mocked his new order. But in each skirmish, each raid, Temüjin's star rose higher. He struck with speed like lightning, with cruelty like winter, with cunning like the fox. His victories multiplied, and each victory brought new men to his camp. Jamura, the blood brother turned enemy, watched with growing dread. Once he had commanded 30,000. Now his numbers shrank as men slipped away to Temüjin's banner. For where Jamuha had given feasts, Temüjin gave justice. Where Jamuha was splendid, Temüjin was inevitable. It was then, upon a ridge overlooking the boundless grass, that Temüjin stood before his followers and lifted his eyes to the eternal blue sky. The wind tore at his hair, the sun burned his face, and his voice, deep and hard, rolled across the plain. Men of the steppe, the sky is vast, but it has chosen me to unite you. No more shall brother betray brother. No more shall orphan be abandoned. No more shall the tribes be prey to one another like wolves. Under my banner we shall be one people, one iron body. Those who follow will be raised high. Those who betray will be ground into the earth. The blue sky commands it, and I am its servant. The warriors cried out as thunder. Spears struck shields, hooves pounded, voices roared until the heavens seemed to tremble. In that roar, the orphan became more than a man. He became a destiny. But the steppe, vast and merciless, was not yet conquered. Before him lay trials more terrible than hunger, betrayals deeper than Jamuha's, battles against powers greater than any the nomads had ever faced. Temüjin was rising like a storm, but storms, too, must test themselves against mountains. The boy who had once gnawed bark in hunger was now a leader of men. Yet in his heart he still carried the silence of the lonely nights, the echo of wolves, the memory of his mother weeping, the taste of blood from his slain brother. These memories were not wounds, but weapons. They were the forge of his will. And so, as the sun set red upon the grasslands, casting long shadows like rivers of fire, Temüjin rode at the head of his companions, his banner streaming behind him. The orphan of the steppe was gone. In his place rode a Khan in the making. The nights that followed were heavy with portent. In the silence of the plain, while the fires of his camp flickered like fallen stars, Temüjin sat apart, his thoughts vast as the horizon. The men whispered, "He speaks to the sky." Perhaps he did, for often he would lift his gaze, stern and searching, as though the eternal blue itself leaned close to whisper its terrible commands. The blue sky had given him hunger, and he had endured. It had given him betrayal, and he had survived. Now it gave him ambition, and he embraced it. The orphans of the tribes, the abandoned, the dispossessed, began to flock to his banner. Each man carried scars, of hunger, of humiliation, of grief. Temüjin bound those scars together into a single strength. He told them, "Your pain is my pain. Your vengeance is my vengeance. Together we are more than victims. Together we are the steppe itself." And so the camp grew. From a scattering of tents, it became a city of felt domes. From a ragged band, it became an army drilled with iron order. Men who once wandered without hope now stood tall, their eyes bright with fire. Temüjin no longer needed to proclaim himself. His name moved upon the winds, carried from hearth to hearth, from fire to fire, across the endless grass. Children played at being him, brandishing sticks as swords. Old men muttered that a new destiny had risen, terrible and inevitable. But destiny, even when it rises like the dawn, does not banish darkness. Rivals gathered, plotting his downfall. Envoys rode with lies, spies crept into tents, assassins sharpened their blades. The steppe is a sea of treachery, and Temüjin, though vigilant, was not immune to its waves. One night, as frost silvered the grass, a band of enemies fell upon his camp. Arrows whistled, horses screamed, flames devoured felt tents. Amid the chaos, Temüjin fought like a storm given flesh. His sword rose and fell, his voice cut through the tumult like iron through silk. His companions, bound by loyalty, formed a wall around him. By dawn, the ground was littered with the fallen. Temüjin stood bloodied but unbroken, and in that victory, more than in any feast, his men knew that he was their Khan, not by proclamation, not by noble birth, but by the iron of his will. Berthe came to him then, her face pale, her hands still trembling from the night's terror. She laid her hand upon his arm and said, "You cannot turn back. You are chosen." Her words were not comfort, but prophecy. Temüjin looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not merely love, but the reflection of the sky itself. The boy who had once gnawed frozen bark to survive, the youth who had slain his brother for food, the exile mocked as a beggar, now stood on the threshold of greatness. His trials had not ended, they had only begun. But the forge of his childhood was complete. The orphan was no longer an orphan. He was the fire of the steppe, the storm rising from its endless horizon. And the world, though it did not yet know, would tremble at his name. Temüjin. The steppe stretched endlessly beneath the eternal blue sky, a land where every horizon looked like freedom, and every shadow whispered of betrayal. Temüjin rode at the head of his companions, no longer a boy gnawing bark for hunger, but not yet the conqueror the world would tremble to name. His men were bound to him by something more enduring than kinship. They were tied by hunger shared, by dangers endured, by the unyielding law he had begun to forge. Where other chieftains bought loyalty with herds and feasts, he gave only the hard gift of order. And to men who had tasted chaos, that gift was dearer than gold. At the banks of a lonely river, reeds swaying like 1,000 mute witnesses, he called them together. They were weary, some still with scars from defeat. Yet when he brought forth the mare and let her blood mingle with the river's water, they came forward without hesitation. One by one they drank, sealing themselves not by bloodline but by vow. Temüjin spoke, his voice steady as iron. The steppe was broken, its people prey to one another, and under the gaze of the eternal blue they would become one body, one law, one destiny. Their oath was not a feast, not a boast, but a covenant, and in their hearts they felt the weight of it, heavier than any armor. But fate does not allow oaths to stand untested. Jamuka, the sworn brother of Temujin's youth, who once had shared his blanket and whispered of dreams beneath the stars, now rose against him in fury. He gathered a host so vast that the earth shook beneath its hooves. Temujin's followers, outnumbered, stood against them as wolves against a storm. The sky filled with arrows, the plain thundered with horses, and the grass was trampled into mud soaked with blood. They fought with the fury of men who had nothing but each other, yet the tide was too great. Defeat came, bitter and crushing. Temujin's camp was broken, his people scattered, his strength mocked by the enormity of loss. But Jamuka's triumph turned quickly to poison. 70 young men, prisoners taken from Temujin's followers, he condemned to death by boiling alive in great iron cauldrons. The air was filled with their screams, and the steppe itself seemed to shudder at the cruelty. No tribe, however proud, could look upon such savagery without unease. The whispers began. Jamuka had broken the balance. He had defied the eternal order of heaven. And in those whispers the shadow of Temujin's return already stirred. In exile once more, Temüjin did not despair. He had known hunger, he had known abandonment. He carried within him a furnace that defeat only stoked. He moved across the steppe not as a fugitive, but as a weaver of destiny. To merchants he offered safe passage, to wandering clans protection, to shamans respect for their visions. He kept his word where other chiefs broke theirs, and word of him traveled farther than his horse could ride. Traders in Samarkand spoke of a Khan who punished thieves and guarded caravans. Shepherds told of a leader who defended widows and orphans. Slowly, one by one, the scattered strands of loyalty began to knit themselves into his banner. Beside him, Berthe remained his anchor. In nights when the fire burned low and his men slept, he would confess his doubts. And she, who had endured captivity and humiliation, yet carried herself like a queen, would remind him that men did not follow him only for spoils or safety. They followed him because he gave them faith that the steppe might be more than endless betrayal. She saw further than he, saw not only the next battle, but the shape of an empire unborn. When his anger urged him to vengeance, she tempered it with justice. When despair whispered, she silenced it with calm certainty. Seasons turned. Hunger gnawed again, betrayal struck again, yet each trial seemed less a wound than a chisel shaping stone. From a scattering of tents rose a camp like a city of felt domes. From a band of survivors grew an army drilled into units that obeyed with precision. Each man was bound not to kin but to command. Each knew his place as surely as he knew the stars above. It was an order unseen on the steppe, and men who once mocked the orphan now feared his law. When at last his black banner of horsehair was raised anew against the sky, it was no longer the sign of a desperate band, but the standard of destiny. Jamuka, hearing of it, felt a dread colder than winter seep into his heart. For he knew that the boy he once called brother had risen from exile remade, no longer equal, but inevitable.
The black banner of Temüjin fluttered against the wind, a streak of shadow across the boundless grass, and under it rode men who had once been cast aside, orphaned, robbed of hope, and now found themselves bound by faith and the promise of a Khan who had forged them from loss.
The plains whispered with their passing, and even the tribes who had mocked him now bowed, whether from fear or awe, for a leader such as Temüjin could bend neither sky nor earth, but could bend men's hearts and wills with the force of destiny. The oaths he had forged along the river were tested repeatedly. Allies sought to betray him for profit, for power, for old grudges. Temüjin met each attempt with unyielding clarity. Those who violated his trust were shown the steel of the steppe. Those who remained loyal were elevated beyond rank, beyond birth, into a brotherhood of iron. It was not kindness that held them, nor fear alone, but the certainty that their lives were now entwined with the tide of fate itself. And yet the heart of Temüjin was not untouched by sorrow. Each betrayal reminded him of the nights he had spent as a boy, huddled under his mother's thin furs, gnawing frozen bark, listening to the wolves circling just beyond the firelight. He remembered Bektor, the brother whose life he had taken, and the pangs of guilt mingled with the hard knowledge that survival had demanded such cruelty. That memory, heavy as a stone, became the cornerstone of his judgment. He would meet justice swiftly, without mercy, but never unjustly. Berte's presence was his constant counsel. She spoke with a voice that was both tender and commanding, reminding him that vengeance without purpose was empty, that power without justice would crumble. "Your men will follow you," she said, "but only if you give them something more than survival. Give them a future, Temüjin, and they will carry you higher than you have yet dreamed." He heeded her words, weaving them into law, into the rhythm of daily life in the camp, into the discipline that turned wandering men into a force unmatched on the steppe. Years passed, the seasons folding into one another, carrying fire and frost alike. Temüjin's forces struck with the speed of wolves, yet he tempered his fury with strategy. Each raid, each skirmish, each conquest was a lesson in the calculus of power and loyalty. Even Jamuka, who had once been his brother, now faced the knowledge that the orphan he had scorned was no longer a boy to be humiliated or defeated. Temüjin's shadow stretched across the steppe, silent, inexorable, a force that drew men not merely by fear, but by faith. It was then, upon a ridge overlooking the plain, that Temüjin looked across the land he would one day unite. The wind tore at his cloak, and the sun painted his features in bronze and shadow. He saw beyond the villages, beyond the tribes quarreling like small animals, beyond the rivers and hills and deserts. He saw a people shaped not by birthright, but by law, by loyalty, by shared destiny. And in that vision he felt the surge of power that would one day ripple across the world. Yet even as he contemplated this future, the reality of the steppe remained harsh. Men could be cruel, neighbors treacherous, and heaven impartial. Temüjin's victories were hard won, his followers forged in fire, his oaths tested again and again by betrayal. But each trial only strengthened him, like steel folded repeatedly to hold the edge. From the ashes of defeat he rose, from the cold of exile he emerged, tempered and resolute. By the time the winter snows fell upon the grass and the rivers iced over, Temüjin was no longer merely a Khan of a few tents and a handful of men. He had become a force recognized across the northern tribes, a man whose name carried both hope and terror. And in the hearts of those who had doubted, who had betrayed, who had feared him, a quiet truth took root. The orphan of the steppe was destined to rise beyond all men, to unite the tribes, and to forge an empire that would be remembered for centuries. And in the quiet of the evening, when the campfires burned low and the wind sighed through the reeds, Temüjin rode among his men, unassuming yet unchallengeable. He did not speak of glory, nor did he boast. His presence alone carried authority, and in that presence was the weight of every oath, every loss, every battle endured. The blood oaths had been sworn, the bonds tested, and from them had emerged a leader who would never again be undone. The steppe was vast, the tribes fractured, but under Temüjin a new unity began to take shape. One forged not in fear alone, not in fleeting alliance, but in the iron of law, the certainty of justice, and the unwavering will of a man who had known hunger, betrayal, and exile, and had risen above them all. The steppe had grown familiar beneath Temüjin's feet, yet no path was ever truly safe, no dawn ever truly certain. The boy who had once gnawed frozen bark had become a man whose presence reshaped the plains. His black banner stretched against the wind, and beneath it rode men forged in the furnace of hardship, men who had endured betrayal, hunger, and exile, and now found purpose in the iron of his command. Temüjin had learned that survival alone was insufficient. A Khan must command not only bodies, but hearts, bending loyalty with justice as much as with steel.
Winter had passed, leaving the earth cracked and dry, and spring arrived with the bitter scent of smoke and blood. Temüjin moved his forces like a shadow, striking where others were unprepared. Villages that had mocked him, tribes that had doubted him, felt the sudden weight of his strategy. The raids were swift, precise, and merciless, yet he spared those who yielded, rewarding the loyal with protection and honor. Through this, he expanded not only his power, but his renown, and men began to speak of him not as a chief, but as destiny walking among them. Every step of conquest, however, bore the shadow of Jamuka. The blood brother, turned tyrant, continued to plot, to muster forces, to reclaim the honor he felt was stolen. Each clash between them was more than battle. It was the collision of fates, a war of wills that reshaped the land itself. Temüjin learned to anticipate betrayal before it arrived, to divide his forces into units that could act independently yet remain inseparable in loyalty. His genius lay not in brute force alone, but in his ability to mold men's hearts and minds, making each warrior feel both feared and cherished. Through the long nights, Temüjin would ride alone across the plains, the cold air biting his face, the moon a thin silver blade above him. He reflected on the faces of those who had fallen, on Bektor, on the 70 men scalded by Jamuka, on his mother's weary eyes, on Borte's calm strength. Each memory was a tool, each sorrow a lesson. Where other men might despair, he built resolve. Where others might quail, he grew unbreakable. The tribes that once dismissed him as orphan and beggar began to send emissaries bearing gifts and oaths. Some came with genuine respect, some with cunning intentions. Temüjin received them all, listening with patience, weighing their words, judging their hearts. He rewarded the faithful and punished deceit, and through this men learned that the laws of Temüjin were absolute, fair, and immutable. No clan dared ignore his summons, for those who defied him found themselves crushed between strategy and speed, cunning and discipline. Berta remained his anchor, and in her presence Temüjin glimpsed the possibility of gentleness beyond the storms of war. She counseled him on justice, reminding him that vengeance without wisdom was empty, that victory without compassion was hollow. Together they guided the camp, raising children amidst the windswept tents, fostering loyalty, and binding men not only to a leader, but to a vision. She became both muse and mirror, reflecting his potential and tempering his fury. With each conquest, Temüjin's name carried further. From distant villages to remote tribes, whispers of the boy-turned-Khan spread like wildfire. Children played at being him, mimicking the precision of his commands, brandishing sticks as swords. Merchants spoke of his fair treatment. Shamans claimed the eternal blue sky guided him. And all the while Jamuka's shadow loomed, reminding Temüjin that victory could never be final, that the fires of conquest burned brightest when ambition and rivalry converged.
Temujin's army, once a handful of exiles, had become a force organized beyond precedent. Each warrior knew his place, yet each felt indispensable. Discipline had replaced chaos, loyalty had replaced fear. They were a brotherhood of survival and purpose, each man's heart bound to the other through trials, oaths, and blood. And Temujin, though burdened with command, bore it as a mantle, unshaken, unyielding, unstoppable. Spring had hardened into summer, and the steppe seemed to tremble beneath Temujin's march. His forces moved with precision, like rivers converging toward the same sea, striking rival clans with speed and strategy that made even seasoned warriors falter. Temujin's mind was a map of the plains, each village, each ridge, each river a point of calculation, a place where loyalty might be won or a betrayal uncovered. No detail escaped him. Every man and horse had a purpose. Every arrow and spear a predetermined path.
The victories multiplied, yet each came with its cost. He buried men he had known since childhood, watched horses he had ridden die in the mud, and witnessed villages burned as a warning. The weight of leadership pressed on him as the cold winds had pressed in his youth. Yet, unlike the boy who had gnawed bark beneath a cold sky, he bore these losses with calm, with clarity, with resolve that became legend in the whispering grass. Jamuka, consumed by pride and envy, struck again. He gathered his forces, hoping to crush Temujin before he could unify the steppe. Their armies collided upon a plain drenched in sunlight, the air thick with dust, sweat, and the cries of men. Arrows darkened the sky, steel clashed, hooves thundered, and the earth itself seemed to roar. Yet Temujin, ever patient, had anticipated the moves of his rival. His formations absorbed the shock of Jamuka's assault and struck back with calculated precision. The battle stretched from dawn until the sun burned low, and when at last the dust settled, Temujin's forces, though bloodied, stood unbroken. The defeated Jamuka retreated, but his shadow lingered. The people of the steppe whispered of the rise of a Khan who could not be defeated by numbers, whose strategy and judgment exceeded any rival, whose name carried both fear and awe. Temujin did not celebrate. Victory was never an end, only a passage to the next challenge. Each conquest was a step, each battle a lesson, each ally won, a trust to be safeguarded. Through these campaigns, Temujin solidified the principles that would define his rule. Loyalty was honored above birth, merit surpassed lineage. Justice was swift, fair, and immutable. Betrayal was punished with precision, and mercy was shown only to those who had earned it. The steppe, long fractured by feud and ambition, began to recognize that its future might belong to a leader unlike any before. Even in the midst of conquest, Temujin's thoughts returned to Berte, to the children they had raised, to the men who followed him. He understood that the strength of a leader lay not in sword or horse alone, but in the bonds that tethered his people to a vision greater than themselves. In quiet moments beneath the stars, he reflected on his own journey, from orphan to exile to Khan in the making, and he knew that every hardship, every betrayal, every loss had forged him into the man who now commanded the steppe.
By the time autumn approached, the tribes had begun to coalesce, drawn not merely by fear, but by the certainty that Temujin's order would endure. Villages once scattered now looked to him for protection. Caravans traveled safely under his banner, and men of all stations sought his counsel and loyalty. The orphan of the steppe had transformed into a figure whose shadow stretched farther than any chieftain who had gone before him. And yet, even as he consolidated power, Temujin knew that the fires of conquest would never truly extinguish. Rivals still lingered in the hills and valleys, alliances were fragile, and the steppe itself demanded vigilance. The boy who had once faced wolves alone now commanded thousands. Yet the lessons of hunger, betrayal, and exile were never forgotten. They were his compass, his sword, his guiding law. Under the black banner, Temüjin rode at the head of his army, a storm in human form, a shadow that stretched across the endless grass. His men followed, not because they feared the sword, but because they believed in the man who had risen from nothing to command destiny itself. Across the plains, the winds carried the sound of hooves, the whisper of a name that would one day be spoken in every corner of the world. And in that whisper, the seeds of empire began to take root. The steppe had begun to recognize a new order, subtle yet undeniable. Where chaos had once ruled, discipline now reigned. Temüjin's banner, black against the eternal blue, stretched across the plains like a shadow of inevitability. The men who rode with him had been tempered in fire and frost, hunger and betrayal, exile and blood, and they carried not only weapons, but the faith that their Khan's vision could unite the fractured tribes. Temüjin moved with the patience of a river cutting stone, knowing that victory demanded more than speed or ferocity. He forged alliances with careful calculation, embracing tribes whose loyalty was uncertain, testing their hearts before granting them the honor of joining his army. He rewarded merit above birth, loyalty above lineage, and in this strange law, new to the steppe but undeniable in its clarity, he created a force that was more than an army. It was a living order, a reflection of the discipline, vision, and will of the orphan who had once gnawed bark beneath a frozen sky. Jamukha's shadow lingered, though diminished, and the blood brother who had once been friend and then rival now became a symbol of the challenges Temüjin had overcome. The tribes whispered of past cruelty, of the boiling of men, and saw in Temüjin a balance of justice tempered by mercy, a leader who could punish but also protect, who could strike fear but inspire devotion. It was a law written not in words but in action, and the men who witnessed it felt its weight in their bones. Across the grasslands, Temüjin's forces expanded. He integrated the men of newly allied tribes into his ranks, not as subjects but as brothers. Each warrior knew his role, each unit its purpose, each man the singular truth that loyalty was sacred and betrayal fatal. The strategy was meticulous, the discipline unbroken, and the speed of his campaigns left other chieftains scrambling in confusion. Villages that had once resisted now offered tribute, clans that had been rivals now sent emissaries, and merchants found safe passage under the shadow of his banner. Borta remained his counsel, his anchor in the chaos of conquest. She reminded him that men needed faith more than gold, and that the unity of the steppe could only survive if it was bound not by fear alone, but by trust, purpose, and law. Together they raised children amid the tents, nurtured loyalty among warriors, and shaped the culture of the camp with a balance of justice and compassion that was unprecedented on the plains. In her presence, Temüjin glimpsed not only the leader he had become, but the empire he might forge. The steppe tested him still. Ambushes, rivalries, and treacheries lurked beyond every ridge. But Temüjin had learned patience. He moved as one who had survived hunger and betrayal, whose mind was always a step ahead of those who sought his downfall. When conflict came, it was met with precision. His strategies were not merely brute force, but anticipation, foresight, and discipline. Even the fiercest opponents fell before him, not always through slaughter, but through calculated mastery of battlefield and mind alike. Each victory strengthened not only his army, but his reputation. Tribes whispered his name in awe and fear. Merchants told tales of his justice and swift punishment of thieves. Shamans spoke of the eternal blue sky walking with him. And through it all, Temüjin remained vigilant, knowing that ambition, envy, and the harshness of the steppe could undo even the greatest Khan if he faltered for a moment. By the time autumn painted the grass golden, Temüjin's influence stretched across hundreds of miles. Clans that had once been enemies now stood in unified ranks under his banner. The orphan who had survived the cold, hunger, and betrayal of his youth now commanded a force capable of shaping the destiny of the entire steppe. And yet, he did not yet see himself as a conqueror. He saw only the next challenge, the next tribe to unite, the next law to enforce, the next step toward a vision that had begun to take form across the endless horizon. The wind carried the scent of grass and smoke, and beneath it Temüjin rode, not as a boy orphaned by fate, nor as a fugitive tested by exile, but as a Khan in the making, his presence commanding the plains and bending hearts before armies even met. The sun dipped low, painting the steppe in hues of fire and gold, and his black banner flapped like a shadow of destiny stretching across the land. Around him, men who had endured betrayal, hunger, and loss now rode with unshakable loyalty, their eyes reflecting the certainty that they followed a man greater than any tale or rumor could contain. The clans that had resisted his rise, that had mocked the orphan who had eaten bark and learned the taste of ice, now sent emissaries with gifts and oaths. Temüjin accepted each not as a master accepting submission, but as a leader testing the hearts of those who would join him. Some came with genuine reverence, others with cunning in their eyes. Each word, each gesture was weighed, measured, and judged. The law of Temüjin was not written on parchment, but on the plains themselves, in the discipline of his army, in the unity of his men, and in the inexorable consequences of loyalty or betrayal. The clans that had resisted his rise, that had mocked the orphan who had eaten bark and learned the taste of ice, now sent emissaries with gifts and oaths. Temüjin accepted each not as a master accepting submission, but as a leader testing the hearts of those who would join him. Some came with genuine reverence, others with cunning in their eyes. Each word, each gesture, each promise was weighed, measured, and judged. The law of Temüjin was not written on parchment, but on the plains themselves, in the discipline of his army, in the unity of his men, and in the inexorable consequences of loyalty or betrayal.
Jamaica lingered like a storm cloud at the edge of the horizon, a reminder of all that had been lost and all that could still rise against him. Yet Temüjin did not fear the shadow of his blood brother. Each clash, each battle, each skirmish had tempered him, sharpened his mind, and taught him that fear was a tool, not a master. He struck with the precision of a falcon diving, with the fury of a wolf defending his pack, with the patience of a river cutting stone over centuries. When the armies met, it was not merely men who fought, but wills, destinies, and the unyielding calculation of a mind that had seen the suffering of hunger and betrayal and turned it into a weapon more terrible than steel. Berthe rode among the tents, her presence a calm counterpoint to the storm of conquest. She nurtured the children, advised the commanders, and reminded Temüjin that victory without justice was hollow, that unity demanded more than force, that the loyalty of men could only be bound by faith as much as by fear. Together they shaped not only an army, but the culture of the steppe itself. The Orphan of Temüjin's youth had transformed into a Khan whose vision reached beyond survival into empire, who measured strength not in hooves or swords, but in hearts and minds. Seasons passed, and with each one the army grew, the unity hardened, the steppe's scattered tribes bending slowly, inevitably under the weight of his presence. He struck down tyrants who clung to power through fear. He brokered alliances that had seemed impossible. He integrated once hostile clans into his fold, and everywhere his name spread like wildfire across the plains. Men whispered in awe and fear. Merchants told tales in the markets of Samarkand. Shamans whispered prayers to the eternal blue sky that Temüjin might lead with wisdom and strength. Even in the moments of victory, Temüjin remembered the nights he had spent huddled under his mother's thin furs, listening to the circling wolves, gnawing frozen bark. Those memories were not burdens, but instruments. They shaped his judgment, honed his strategy, and tempered his justice. He executed the law with precision, punished betrayal swiftly, rewarded loyalty generously, and bound man not to his will by fear alone, but by the certainty that following him meant survival, honor, and a share in a destiny larger than themselves.
The steppe itself seemed to bend beneath him,
Villages once scattered and fearful now sought his protection. Caravans traveled safely under his banner. Tribes long in conflict came together under a single standard. Even the wind seemed to carry his name. Temüjin, whispered in awe, carried on the hooves of horses the cries of warriors, the chatter of children playing at his deeds. At night, under the endless sky, Temüjin would ride among the fires of his camp. The stars reflected in his eyes, the quiet crackle of flames mirrored the temper of his mind, and the cold air brought clarity sharper than any sword. He understood that his rise was not merely conquest, it was the forging of a people, the shaping of the steppe, the bending of a fractured world toward a new order. The boy who had been an orphan, who had gnawed bark, who had endured betrayal and hunger, now commanded not just men, but fate itself. And in that quiet, when the fires burned low and the wind whispered across the endless grass, he realized that his greatest battles were not with armies or tyrants, but with time, with destiny, with the challenge of uniting a wild, fractured land. Yet he felt no fear. He had survived hunger, exile, betrayal, and the cruelty of men. Nothing remained that could unmake him. The steppe, the tribes, and the world beyond would bend to him, not because he demanded it, but because he had endured, and in enduring had become greater than any force the plains had ever known. The black banner rose higher against the sky. The hooves of his men thundered across the plains. Temüjin's eyes, steady and cold, gazed toward the horizon where the world awaited him. He was no longer orphan, exile, or boy. He was a Khan in the making, and the steppe, long fractured, would soon bow beneath a name that would echo across centuries. The plains stretched endlessly beneath the blazing sun, a sea of gold and green rippling with the wind. Temüjin rode at the head of his men, the black banner snapping above them like the shadow of destiny itself. The tribes of the steppe, long fractured by feud and pride, now began to feel the inexorable pull of a single force, one that moved with the precision of a storm and the patience of a river carving stone. His army, forged through hunger, betrayal, and countless battles, was no longer a mere band of warriors. It was an order, an army shaped by law, loyalty, and the vision of a Khan whose eyes had seen suffering, exile, and injustice, and had turned it into unbreakable resolve. As Temüjin's forces approached the valleys where rival clans had gathered, the air vibrated with anticipation. Warriors sharpened their blades, horses pawed at the ground, and the distant hills echoed with the drums of war. Yet the Khan did not rush. He surveyed the terrain, reading the land as one reads the faces of men, discerning hidden paths, potential ambushes, the strength and weakness of his enemies. To Temüjin, the battlefield was not chaos. It was a canvas, and he was the master painter, moving pieces with meticulous care. The clans that had resisted him were numerous and fierce, bound together by centuries of enmity and fear of domination. Yet even as they gathered, doubt gnawed at their hearts. Whispers of Temüjin's name had traveled far, carried by traders, by fleeing messengers, by the very wind across the steppe. They had heard of his victories, his discipline, his laws, his rewards for loyalty and punishments for betrayal. And they knew that the orphan who had gnawed bark and endured exile was no longer a boy. They knew that he was a storm that could not be resisted. The first clash came at dawn. The plains erupted into a frenzy of movement, hooves thundering, men screaming, arrows blackening the sky. Temüjin moved like a shadow within the chaos, his commands precise, his strategy flawless. Units flanked where they were needed,
reserves struck with perfect timing, and the enemy's lines began to crumble under the combination of fear, discipline, and unrelenting force. Temüjin himself fought at the center, his presence both inspiration and terror, a figure of iron and resolve. Amid the battle, he saw moments that would be etched in memory forever. A young warrior shielding a comrade, a rival chief's banner tumbling in the dust, the wind carrying the clash of steel like the roar of the steppe itself. Yet even as victory approached, Temüjin remained calm, calculating the next move, knowing that one mistake could undo all. The art of war, he knew, was not merely in defeating the enemy, but in shaping the hearts of men so that they remained loyal, bound not by fear alone, but by faith in the leader who had proven himself in fire and frost, in exile and hunger.
By mid-morning, the battle was decided. The rival clans, though brave and fierce, had been broken. Temüjin's forces stood victorious, yet the Khan offered mercy to those who surrendered and integrated the tribes into his growing confederation. Through wisdom and force alike, he began the process of unifying the steppe, turning scattered clans into a single disciplined entity. Each man, whether born to a noble line or orphaned like himself, found place and purpose under his law, and each recognized the immeasurable inevitability of his leadership. Even in the midst of triumph, Temüjin's thoughts turned to the future. He knew the steppe would never remain fully still, that ambition, jealousy, and the thirst for revenge would always linger. Yet he had learned patience, strategy, and foresight. Every alliance he forged, every law he enforced, every man he elevated or punished was a step toward the grand vision that had begun as a flicker in his mind when he was a boy surviving the frozen nights. He rode among his men as the sun fell, the wind carrying both the scent of blood and the whisper of victory. And in that moment, the Khan saw the horizon not as endless plains, but as a land that could finally be united, a people that could finally be bound under a single law, a single vision, a single name. The victory had settled like a silent weight across the plains. Temüjin rode among his men, the black banner fluttering high, casting a long shadow over the grasslands. The tribes he had defeated, tamed, or allied with were slowly being stitched into a tapestry of unity, bound not merely by fear, but by trust and the certainty that their lives and futures were inextricably linked to the strength of the Khan. Every man who had once fought against him now walked beneath his standard, and in their eyes was a mixture of awe, fear, and an uneasy respect born of understanding that Temüjin's vision could not be resisted. Even in the midst of triumph, Temüjin's thoughts turned to the future. He knew the steppe would never remain fully still, that ambition, jealousy, and the thirst for revenge would always linger. Yet he had learned patience, strategy, and foresight. Every alliance he forged, every law he enforced, every man he elevated or punished, was a step toward the grand vision that had begun as a flicker in his mind when he was a boy surviving the frozen nights. He rode among his men as the sun fell, the wind carrying both the scent of blood and the whisper of victory. And in that moment, the Khan saw the horizon not as endless plains, but as a land that could finally be united, a people that could finally be bound under a single law, a single vision, a single name.
The consolidation of clans required more than military might. Temüjin understood the hearts of men. He met with chieftains, some stubborn, some ambitious, some fearful, and he offered them a choice: integration and honor, or isolation and annihilation. Some resisted, but none could stand against the combined force of his army and the gravity of his reputation. Slowly, as days became weeks, the once fractured tribes began to recognize the benefits of his leadership. Roads and trade routes were opened under his protection. Raiding parties that had once plundered indiscriminately were now bound to his law. Disputes between clans were arbitrated under the principles he enforced. It was a law of fairness and force alike, respected and feared, and under it the steppe began to change. Temüjin's army grew not only in size, but in cohesion. Men trained, drilled, and fought together as if they were a single organism. The bonds of loyalty were reinforced through shared hardship, oath, and reward. Each victory brought more men to his banner. Each alliance strengthened the whole. And even those who had once mocked the Orphan came to acknowledge that a new order was being forged under the endless sky. Through the long nights, Temüjin reflected on the path he had walked. The ghosts of the past, betrayal, hunger, exile, the blood of his enemies and friends alike were not burdens but instruments that had honed his resolve. Borta's counsel remained his guiding star. She reminded him that mercy could be as potent as the sword, that loyalty required justice as much as fear, and that the unity of the tribes depended not solely on victories, but on vision and the certainty of purpose. Their shared gaze upon the campfires often carried him beyond the moment, toward the future he was slowly shaping, a steppe bound under law, a people disciplined yet loyal, and a Khan whose shadow stretched farther than the eye could see. Yet even in this consolidation, challenges arose. Minor rebellions flared in distant valleys. Envoys brought warnings of rival chieftains mustering forces, and rumors of Jamuka's machinations persisted like a persistent wind. Temüjin met each challenge with patience, strategy, and the understanding that the true battle was not only fought with sword and horse, but with law, respect, and the forging of belief. Each clan that joined his confederation added strength, but also responsibility. Each victory brought new faces in new hearts that had to be guided, disciplined, and made to understand that under Temüjin, the steppe was no longer wild. It was order, and that order demanded loyalty and faith.
As autumn approached, the first seeds of empire began to take root. The once fragmented tribes now moved as one in many matters, raiding parties coordinated under his banner, trade routes secured by his law, and councils of allied chieftains convened to discuss governance under his guidance. Temüjin rode among them, always observing, always calculating, ensuring that loyalty was earned, justice administered, and power consolidated. The Khan was no longer merely a warrior or survivor. He was the living embodiment of law and vision on the plains. At night, beneath the infinite sky, Temüjin would ride alone, letting the wind carry his thoughts. He considered the horizon, the rivers, the mountains and the valley still beyond his reach. The tribes yet unbound were many, the challenges immense, and the specter of rivals like Jamuka remained a constant shadow. Yet he did not waver. Each conquest, each alliance, each battle had been a lesson. Each hardship endured had forged him stronger. His eyes, reflecting the stars above, held the certainty of a future that stretched far beyond the present. A steppe united, a people loyal, and a Khan whose name would echo through time. And so as the fires of the camps burned low and the wind whispered through the endless grass, Temüjin prepared for the next stage of his destiny. The storm of tribes had begun, but the storm was far from complete. Beyond the horizon lay new challenges, greater enemies, and the promise of empire. The boy who had gnawed bark, the orphan who had endured exile, hunger, and betrayal was now a Khan. Yet even as he rode beneath the eternal blue sky, he knew that the greatest victories were still to come, and that the true forging of the steppe had only just begun.
Scouts returned with news of distant gatherings, rival chiefs uniting to resist his rise. Yet Temüjin did not falter. Each report was assessed, each threat measured, each potential ally tested. The steppe was not won through brute force alone. It required foresight, strategy, and the delicate manipulation of hearts and loyalties. Temüjin had learned patience, the rhythm of men and horses, the sway of ambition, and the fragility of pride. He moved as if the land itself was an extension of his mind, predicting movements, planning contingencies, and knowing that a single misstep could unravel years of careful construction. When the first great clash came, it was thunderous. The plains erupted into chaos as thousands of warriors converged, hooves striking the earth like the pounding of war drums, steel clashing under a sky that seemed to tremble. Temüjin rode at the center, his presence both calm and terrifying. Every unit knew its role, every man trusted the plan. His strategy was a weaving of feints, ambushes, and precise strikes, orchestrated so that the enemy felt never only defeat, but inevitability. The clash lasted from dawn until the sun hung low and red above the horizon, and when the dust settled, Temüjin's forces remained unbroken, his rivals scattered and demoralized. Even in victory, Temüjin offered mercy to those who surrendered and recognized the honor of bravery. Clans once at war now bent to his law, not solely out of fear, but because they saw the benefits of unity and the justice of his command. He integrated these clans into his growing confederation, elevating warriors of merit and establishing councils to mediate disputes according to principles he enforced. The steppe, long divided by enmity, began to recognize a new order, one tempered by law and sustained by loyalty. Bortea's counsel remained constant. She reminded Temüjin that the strength of the Khan was not only measured in victories, but in the cohesion of the people he governed. Her insight guided him as he forged new alliances and strengthened the old. Under her guidance, he established systems to enforce justice, to reward loyalty, and to punish treachery with fairness and precision. Together, they shaped the army into a disciplined yet humane force, capable of overwhelming any enemy, yet bound by the principles of a new order. Temüjin's thoughts often returned to his childhood, to the bitter cold, the gnawed bark, the exile and hunger. Those memories were now tools, forging his judgment and strategy. Every hardship endured was a lesson, every betrayal a warning, every loss a guide. The boy who had once survived on scraps in fear now commanded thousands, shaping the steppe as a sculptor shapes stone. And as the wind swept across the plains, it seemed to carry whispers of his name, Temüjin, a Khan, rising from nothing to become the force that would unite the tribes and reshape the destiny of Asia. The steppe's unification was not yet complete, but the foundation had been laid. The clans that had resisted his authority now recognized both his strength and the inevitability of his rule. The laws he enforced, the loyalty he demanded, the justice he administered, were slowly knitting the tribes into a single, cohesive force. And Temüjin, riding among the banners, felt the surge of power and responsibility alike. The knowledge that the destiny of the steppe was entwined with his vision, and that the true test of his leadership was only beginning. The first light of dawn broke across the endless plains, casting long shadows over the banners of Temüjin's army. The air was crisp,
carrying the scent of horses, smoke, and anticipation. Today, the scattered tribes who had resisted, doubted, or ignored his rise would see that the steppe no longer belonged to chance, to feuds, or to pride. It belonged to a Khan whose vision, patience, and unyielding will could bend even the wildest hearts to a single purpose. Hours passed, and by afternoon the battle was effectively decided. The clans that had resisted were broken, their leaders captured or scattered, their warriors either integrated into Temüjin's ranks or sent home under oath. Mercy was extended to those who surrendered with honor, punishment to those who resisted with treachery. Through both force and fairness, Temüjin began the final act of unification, binding the tribes not only by the sword, but by law and the certainty of justice. As the dust settled, emissaries from distant valleys approached. Tribes long at odds came forward, offering fealty and allegiance. Temüjin listened, weighing each word, each gesture, each hidden motive. By nightfall, the steppe had begun to coalesce under a single banner, a single law, a single vision. The Khan had achieved what no other leader had, the first true unification of the nomadic peoples, tempered by strategy, loyalty, and justice. Berthe stood beside him as the campfires burned low, watching the banners sway under the wind. "You have done what others could not even dream," she said softly. "But the steppe is still wild, still restless. True unity is more than allegiance, it is belief, Temüjin. And belief must be forged every day." Temüjin nodded, knowing the truth in her words. Even with victory achieved, the work of leadership, of law, of vision was eternal. The Khan rode among his men that night, beneath the glittering stars of the eternal blue sky. He observed the faces of warriors, young and old, noble and orphaned alike, and felt the weight and power of destiny pressing upon him. The tribes were united, yet each man carried the memory of his own hardships and pride. Temüjin knew that trust must be maintained, loyalty earned anew with each passing season, each decision, each act of justice or mercy. In that quiet, under the endless heavens, he allowed himself a rare reflection. He had risen from nothing, from hunger and exile, to command the steppe. He had survived betrayal and hardship, faced enemies that would have crushed lesser men, and emerged not only victorious, but as a visionary capable of shaping an entire people. The future stretched before him, vast and uncharted, yet for the first time Temüjin glimpsed a path, a steppe united under law, a people bound not only by fear, but by trust, loyalty, and shared destiny, and a Khan whose name would echo across continents and centuries.
The fires of conquest had burned, the storm of tribes had passed, and from the ashes arose a Khan whose shadow would never be diminished. The steppe was no longer merely wild, it was law, order, and unity forged in fire, blood, and vision. And Temüjin, orphan, exile, warrior, and now Khan, knew that this was only the beginning. Beyond the horizon, empires awaited, kingdoms trembling, and a destiny that would span continents and endure through time. He looked toward the rising moon, its silver light reflecting off the banners and the eyes of his men. "The steppe is ours," he whispered, not as boast, but as acknowledgment of a new world being born. And in that whisper, the winds carried a promise. Temüjin would not merely unite the tribes. He would become a force remembered forever. A Khan who had turned survival into empire and chaos into destiny. Winter had receded, leaving the steppe alive with the scent of thawing earth and the whispers of rivers that had been frozen. Temüjin rode at the head of his army, the black banner snapping in the wind, his eyes scanning the horizon with a calm that belied the tempest within. The steppe was now united under his law, yet beyond the familiar grasslands lay powerful rivals and kingdoms whose ambitions clashed with his own. To conquer the steppe was one triumph. To extend that power beyond, into lands governed by older kings and fortified cities, would be a test of strategy, patience, and resolve unlike any he had faced. The first campaigns were against tribes who had not yet submitted, their loyalty tied to pride, wealth, and past enmities. Temüjin approached not as a conqueror, but as a master of calculation. He offered alliances to those who showed merit, but any who resisted faced the precision of his tactics. His army moved as a single organism, each unit anticipating the next, each commander executing the plan with near telepathic understanding. The clash of swords and shields rang across the plains, but more than brute force, Temüjin wielded fear, respect, and strategy to break his opponents. In one notable battle, the plains shook with the charge of thousands of warriors, arrows darkened the sky, and the ground was churned to mud by the pounding hooves of horses. Temüjin stood at the center, directing the flow of men, flanking maneuvers perfectly timed, reserves striking at the precise moment to collapse the enemy's lines. The clash lasted from dawn to the setting sun, yet his forces remained disciplined and unbroken. Victory was absolute, yet he spared those who submitted with honor, binding them to his law and integrating their warriors into his growing army. Borte's wisdom continued to guide him, reminding him that conquest alone did not build an empire. Justice, fairness, and the careful cultivation of loyalty were as crucial as strategy and force. Together, they established systems to arbitrate disputes, to reward merit, and to enforce the clan's law across vast distances. The tribes, once independent and fractious, began to recognize a new order, one that was greater than any individual clan or chief, and rooted in the vision of Temüjin himself.
Beyond the steppe, rumors of his campaigns reached distant kingdoms.
Merchants spoke of his disciplined army, spies whispered of his strategies, and rival kings began to take notice. Temüjin knew that his rise would provoke formidable enemies, men who had ruled for generations and would not surrender without testing the strength of his resolve. Yet he welcomed the challenge. Every battle, every negotiation, every alliance was a step toward building not merely power, but an empire capable of enduring beyond his lifetime. The steppe itself seemed to bow to his presence. Rivers, ridges, and valleys were no longer merely landforms. They were elements of strategy, avenues for movement, and markers of influence. Scouts and envoys moved constantly, carrying messages, gathering intelligence, and ensuring that every action of Temüjin's army was measured and deliberate. The boy who had survived the frost and hunger of youth now commanded not merely men, but the very land itself, bending it to his vision with the patience and force of a master sculptor. Temüjin's army was no longer a collection of clans and warriors. It was a disciplined force, bound by oath, shared hardship, and a belief in their Khan's destiny. Each victory added new men, new skills, and new loyalty. Former enemies were incorporated, trained, and made indispensable. The unity of the steppe, once a fragile dream, now became tangible, a force that could challenge kingdoms beyond the plains and rewrite the balance of power across the continent. Yet, even with conquest and loyalty secured, Temüjin remained vigilant. Rumors of Jamuka persisted, a spectre of the past reminding him that threats often lingered unseen. Beyond the steppe, fortified cities and established kingdoms loomed as new challenges, each requiring a combination of diplomacy, cunning, and the unrelenting force he had perfected over years of struggle. The expansion of empire was no longer a battle of survival. It was the forging of destiny. And so, as the sun dipped behind distant mountains and the wind carried the whispers of tribes both allied and adversarial, Temüjin rode at the head of his men, the black banner above him, a symbol of law, power, and inevitability. He was no longer merely a Khan of the steppe. He was the architect of a growing empire, a force whose shadow would stretch far beyond the plains, across kingdoms, rivers, and mountains. Each step he took was a measure of strategy, patience, and destiny, converging into a path that few could resist and none could ignore. The plains had become a canvas upon which Temüjin painted his vision, each movement of his army a stroke of inevitability. Beyond the familiar grasslands lay fortified cities and ancient kingdoms, their rulers unaware of the storm that approached. Scouts returned with news of treacherous passes, garrisoned walls, and alliances of kings fearful of his rise. Yet Temüjin welcomed these challenges. They were no longer threats. They were the crucible through which his destiny would be forged.
His forces moved with the precision of a single organism. Cavalry scouted the ridges, infantry held the passes, and archers waited like the shadows of death. Each engagement was a lesson in strategy and patience. Where rivals sought to overwhelm, Temüjin drew them into traps, turning their strength against them, collapsing their formations and leaving survivors to understand the inevitability of his command. His victories were decisive yet calculated, ruthless yet fair to those who submitted. Each conquest added not only land, but men, horses, and loyalty to the ever-expanding empire under his banner. In one decisive encounter, a coalition of rival tribes and minor kingdoms had gathered, confident in their numbers. The plains trembled as thousands charged, hooves striking the earth in unison, shields clashing, and the air thick with dust and the cries of warriors. Temüjin, standing at the center of his forces, orchestrated the battle with uncanny foresight. Flanking maneuvers cut through enemy lines, reserves struck at precisely the right moment, and the coalition was fractured before they realized the precision of the assault. Victory was swift and absolute.
The enemy leaders who survived were bound to his law. Their warriors were incorporated into his ranks, trained, and made loyal. The expansion was not merely territorial, it was structural, binding new men and lands into a coherent, disciplined whole. Berthe watched from a rise above the camp as the aftermath unfolded. She understood the scope of Temüjin's ambition. It was not enough to conquer. He needed order, loyalty, and belief. Her counsel guided him in the subtlety of governance, how to turn former enemies into allies, how to enforce law without breeding resentment, how to ensure that the empire he built was resilient to the ambition and betrayal that always lurked beyond. Temüjin listened, observed, and acted, integrating her wisdom into his strategies as seamlessly as he integrated the conquered tribes into his growing confederation. By winter, the expansion of empire was undeniable. The steppe was no longer merely a collection of tribes. It was a unified force under a single law, a single vision, and a single Khan. Beyond the steppe, kingdoms recognized that a new power had risen, one capable of challenging old empires and reshaping the balance of power. Temüjin's name traveled ahead of him like a shadow, whispered in awe, fear, and reluctant respect. His army, disciplined, loyal, and bound by both oath and shared hardship, had become an unstoppable force.
Even in moments of triumph, Temüjin reflected on the boy he had once been, the orphan who had gnawed frozen bark, who had endured hunger, betrayal, and exile. Those memories were instruments that shaped his judgment and resolve. The Khan had learned that conquest alone did not build an empire. Law, loyalty, strategy, and belief were equally essential. Each victory, each alliance, each integration of conquered men and lands was a step toward a vision greater than himself. A step united, an empire in formation, a destiny unfolding across the continent. As he rode beneath the rising moon, the black banner above his head, Temüjin allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The expansion was far from complete, yet the foundation was secure. Tribes were united, enemies subdued or assimilated, and the first outlines of empire were taking shape. The Khan's gaze turned toward the horizon, toward distant lands yet unconquered, kingdoms with stone walls, armies drilled and disciplined, rulers whose ambitions could rival even Temüjin himself. The Khan knew that greater battles awaited, that the forging of his empire had only just begun, and that destiny, like the steppe wind, could not be restrained. The fires of conquest had burned, the storm of tribes had passed, and the shadow of Temüjin now stretched farther than any before him. The steppe was no longer wild, it was law, order, and unity. And the Khan, orphan, exile, warrior, and now conqueror, understood that the empire he had begun to shape would endure long after the echoes of today's battles faded into legend. Each breath of wind, each sway of banner, each whispered name of Temüjin carried with it the certainty that history had begun to bend beneath the weight of his vision, and that the world itself would never forget the rise of this Khan from nothing to the architect of empire. The steppe stretched endlessly, pale under the dawn sun, yet the winds carried whispers of lands beyond. Kingdoms with stone walls, armies drilled and disciplined, rulers whose ambitions could rival even Temüjin himself. The Khan rode at the head of his army, black banner flapping, eyes like cold steel scanning the horizon. Years of conquest had honed him, and the unification of the tribes was complete. Yet the world beyond the steppe remained untamed not by nature, but by men who wielded power and feared none. Temüjin's scouts returned with reports of fortified cities, alliances of kings, and the stirrings of rebellion in lands that had not yet known the inevitability of his rise. He did not flinch. He had faced hunger, exile, betrayal, and overwhelming odds. Kingdoms beyond the steppe were but another challenge, another step toward destiny.
He called his generals, plotting with precision, each movement calculated, each battle planned with foresight that bordered on clairvoyance. His army, disciplined and loyal, waited like a living shadow, ready to strike with force and strategy combined.
The first confrontations came in the valleys bordering the steppe, where minor kingdoms had allied to resist him. Temüjin moved swiftly, blending diplomacy and force. Those who submitted with honor were integrated, their warriors trained and their leaders elevated within his hierarchy. Those who resisted faced calculated devastation. The clash of armies turned plains into arenas of chaos, yet Temüjin's leadership ensured cohesion amidst fury. Arrows darkened the sky, hooves thundered, and men screamed, yet each movement was orchestrated, each strike purposeful. Victory came not only through force, but through the understanding of fear, honor, and the hearts of men. As winter approached, Temüjin's name echoed across the borders. Merchants spoke in hushed tones. Envoys carried tales of his disciplined forces, and rival kings began to prepare, uncertain whether diplomacy or war would define the coming years. Temüjin welcomed both. His vision was beyond mere conquest. It was empire, order, and destiny. Each alliance forged, each city subdued, each clan integrated was a brick in the foundation of a realm that would endure beyond his lifetime. Berthe remained his anchor and counsel, guiding the Khan not only in strategy, but in governance. Her insights into loyalty, justice, and the management of diverse peoples ensured that each victory strengthened the empire rather than merely expanding it. Temüjin understood that the greatest battles were often not on the field, but in hearts, in oaths, in the balance of fear and respect that bound men to their leader. By spring, Temüjin advanced toward the more formidable kingdoms, stone walls and trained armies confronting him as if to challenge fate itself. Yet the Khan moved with patience, using spies, envoys, and careful feints to weaken opposition before engagement. Battles erupted in great waves, cavalry sweeping through open plains, infantry holding key positions, archers raining death with precision. Each victory demonstrated not only strength, but strategy, ensuring loyalty and obedience among those who had once been enemies. The consolidation of these territories marked a turning point. Temüjin was no longer merely a Khan of the steppe. He was a power recognized beyond its borders, feared, respected, and inevitable.
Temüjin rode at the head of his forces beneath the endless sky, reflecting on the boy he had been, the orphan, the exile, the survivor of hunger and betrayal. Those memories, once painful, had become tools, instruments of strategy, and a moral compass for leadership. Each hardship endured had prepared him for this moment, the confrontation with kingdoms, the shaping of loyalty, the forging of empire. The steppe was no longer the limit of his world. It was the foundation upon which he would rise to become a ruler of continents. And as night fell, fires burned across the plains, signaling both victory and vigilance. Temüjin knew that beyond the horizon awaited enemies yet unconquered, territories yet to be shaped, and challenges that would test the limits of his resolve. Yet he did not fear. Each battle won, each alliance forged, each law enforced brought him closer to the destiny he had glimpsed in the frost-bitten nights of his youth. The Khan was ready, the empire expanding, and the world itself beginning to bend beneath the shadow of Temüjin. The sun rose over the steppe, casting long shadows across the banners of Temüjin's army. The distant cities, once thought impregnable, now trembled beneath the inevitability of his advance. Every village, every fortress, every tribe that had resisted his rise now faced the reality that his vision was unstoppable. The Khan moved with the calm certainty of a man who had seen both the depths of despair and the heights of triumph, and who understood that destiny is carved by patience as much as by steel. The final campaigns unfolded with breathtaking precision. Temüjin's forces struck in synchrony, cavalry and infantry coordinated with uncanny foresight, archers raining arrows like a storm across the battlefield. Rivers and ridges were used to channel enemy forces. Fortifications were surrounded before resistance could solidify, and leaders who had once scoffed at the orphan boy now knelt in submission. Each victory was decisive, yet tempered with justice. Each conquered city, each subdued kingdom was offered the opportunity to integrate, to pledge loyalty, and to join in the creation of a new order. Borte's wisdom guided him through the subtleties of governance. She ensured that conquered peoples were not merely subjects, but partners in the growing empire. Her counsel reminded Temüjin that loyalty bred strength, that fairness reinforced power, and that the hearts of men could be bound as firmly as any sword or wall. Through this approach, resistance faded, alliances solidified, and the foundations of a true empire were laid upon both fear and respect. By the time the spring thaw arrived, Temüjin's authority extended beyond the steppe to distant kingdoms whose rulers had once believed themselves untouchable.
In one remarkable encounter, a coalition of the most powerful kingdoms attempted to resist his rise. The plains shook with the clash of thousands of warriors, the air thick with dust, fire, and steel. Yet Temüjin's strategy prevailed. He exploited divisions, anticipated maneuvers, and struck decisively where resistance was weakest. Victory was total, and in its wake the coalition leaders were bound to his law, their soldiers integrated, and their cities absorbed into the growing network of the empire. The world beyond the steppe had begun to recognize the reality. Temüjin was no longer merely a conqueror of tribes. He was the master of kingdoms. The Khan rode among the banners, observing the faces of his men and the citizens of newly integrated lands. He reflected on the path that had brought him here, from gnawed bark and frostbitten nights to the leader of an empire stretching across continents. Each hardship endured, each betrayal survived, and each victory won had been a step toward this moment. The boy who had once known only survival had become a Khan whose shadow would darken history itself. Night fell, and the fires of conquest burned across the plains and cities alike. Temüjin gazed at the stars, seeing not just constellations, but possibilities, territories, and futures yet to be shaped. He knew that the unification of the steppe and the subjugation of distant kingdoms were but the foundation. The creation of an empire required law, governance, and the enduring loyalty of men who had once been his enemies. Yet he was ready. The Khan's vision stretched far beyond the horizon, into lands unknown, across kingdoms yet unconquered, and toward a destiny that would echo through centuries. As the winds swept across the plains, carrying the whispers of submission, loyalty, and awe, Temüjin allowed himself a quiet acknowledgment of the magnitude of his rise. The steppe was unified, kingdoms bowed, and the first outlines of empire were complete. The boy who gnawed bark, endured hunger and exile, and survived betrayal was now a Khan whose name would be remembered forever. Temüjin, master of the steppe, conqueror of kingdoms, and future emperor, had transformed destiny itself into reality.
And in that quiet, beneath the endless sky, he understood. The forging of an empire was complete, yet the shaping of history had only begun. The shadow of Temüjin stretched across continents, and the world would never be the same. The orphan, the exile, the warrior, the Khan, the man who would become known as Genghis Khan, had arrived. The steppe had become a realm of law and order, yet beneath its vast expanse the hearts of men remained as wild and restless as the wind that swept across the plains. Temüjin, now the recognized Khan of a vast empire stretching from the grasslands to fortified cities, rode at the head of his army, black banner high, eyes sharp and calculating. The unification of tribes and conquest of kingdoms had been achieved, yet the true challenge of leadership lay not in victory alone, but in the management of power, loyalty, and ambition.
Reports flowed in from distant corners of the empire. Minor rebellions, disputes between newly integrated clans, and whispers of treachery reminded Temüjin that conquest was merely the first step. Governing an empire required the precise balance of justice and fear, reward and punishment, loyalty and discipline. He summoned his generals and advisors, devising systems of law, taxation, and military organization that would bind the tribes and cities into a single coherent structure. Temüjin understood that men who had once fought him to the death could now become the foundation of enduring power, if guided wisely. The consolidation of power began with the enforcement of strict laws across the steppe and conquered lands. Theft, betrayal, and dishonor were punished decisively, yet loyalty, valor, and service were rewarded generously. Temüjin's councils, guided by the wisdom of Berta and other trusted advisors, met regularly to arbitrate disputes, ensuring that justice was visible and respected. This careful administration fostered trust even among those who had once been his enemies. Meanwhile, the Khan continued to expand strategic alliances with neighboring powers. Envoys carried messages of friendship and intimidation alike, forging relationships that would protect the empire's borders while preparing for future campaigns. Temüjin knew that true power was not only measured in armies and battles, but in diplomacy, in the ability to bend potential adversaries to his vision without shedding unnecessary blood. His presence became a force of inevitability. Governors, chiefs, and kings alike recognized that resisting Temüjin meant both peril and futility. The steppe warriors under his command now trained rigorously, their discipline unmatched. Temüjin implemented systems of communication, supply, and intelligence that ensured rapid deployment and coordination across vast distances. He moved among the banners, observing, testing, and inspiring. Loyalty was earned not only through fear, but through the respect inspired by competence, foresight, and fairness. Each man who served him understood that under Temüjin, survival, honor, and glory were intertwined. Yet threats remained. Jamuka's lingering followers, ambitious chieftains, and rival kingdoms sought opportunities to challenge the Khan's authority. Temüjin met these challenges with strategic patience. He allowed small rebellions to collapse under their own internal divisions. He integrated skilled leaders into his administration, and he struck decisively where weakness or disobedience appeared. Every move was calculated, ensuring that the empire grew not only in size, but in cohesion and resilience. By the time spring returned, the foundations of a true empire had been solidified. The Khan's authority extended unchallenged from the southern ridges of the steppe to the northern rivers, from fortified cities to nomadic encampments. Each conquered tribe and kingdom now recognized the inevitability of his law, the justice of his rule, and the enduring strength of his leadership. Temüjin was no longer merely a conqueror. He was a ruler, a legislator, a unifier of diverse peoples under a single vision. The fires of the steppe burned as the Khan rode beneath the endless sky, contemplating both the empire he had forged and the responsibilities it demanded. He thought of the boy who had survived frost, hunger, and betrayal, of the man who had turned exile into strategy and loss into power. Those lessons, etched into his very being, guided every decision, every law, and every campaign. Temüjin knew that consolidation was not static. It required vigilance, foresight, and the constant shaping of hearts as well as borders. And so, beneath the stars of the eternal blue sky, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The steppe was united, the kingdoms subdued, and the empire poised for greatness. Yet the future remained uncertain, filled with challenges that would test his wisdom, courage, and vision. Temüjin, now a Khan of unparalleled power, understood that the forging of an enduring empire demanded more than conquest. It demanded foresight, law, loyalty, and an unbreakable will. Winter had given way to spring, yet the steppe remained harsh, a constant reminder that even victory demanded vigilance. Temüjin rode among his banners, black flags snapping in the wind, surveying the lands that had once been fragmented by pride, vengeance, and ambition. Now these lands were bound not only by his sword, but by law, respect, and a shared vision of unity. The empire he had forged was vast, stretching from distant ridges to fortified cities. Yet each victory carried the responsibility of governance, and each conquered clan required careful oversight. Temüjin established a system of councils, blending the wisdom of seasoned chieftains with his own unyielding vision. Justice was codified. Disputes were resolved openly, ensuring that both tribes and city-states saw the fairness of his rule. Chiefs who had resisted now served under his command, their loyalty earned through opportunity, honor, and the recognition of Temüjin's unmatched judgment. Those who betrayed were punished swiftly, reinforcing the law that was now the backbone of the empire. The Khan's military organization became legendary. Cavalry units moved with unparalleled precision. Scouts relayed intelligence across vast distances, and supply lines ensured that no force under his banner suffered for lack of preparation. Temüjin observed his men constantly, testing loyalty, courage, and discipline. He understood that an empire's strength was measured not merely in territory, but in cohesion, morale, and the unwavering commitment of his people.
Challenges persisted. Small uprisings flared, rival chiefs plotted in secret, and the echoes of old adversaries whispered in distant lands. Yet Temüjin's response was measured, blending force with strategy. He integrated capable leaders into his administration, neutralized rebellious elements, and demonstrated through decisive action that opposition was futile. Every step reinforced the empire's stability, every conquest solidified its structure, and every alliance enhanced its reach. Temüjin's consolidation of power was not limited to governance and military might. He encouraged trade between regions, secured roads for caravans, and ensured that wealth and resources flowed efficiently across the empire. By providing order, opportunity, and protection, he transformed former adversaries into allies, weaving a network of loyalty that spanned diverse peoples and territories. The Khan often reflected on the path that had brought him here, from a boy gnawing frozen bark, surviving exile and betrayal, to a ruler commanding a vast empire with unwavering authority. Each hardship endured,
each enemy defeated, and each alliance forged had prepared him for this moment, the creation of a lasting legacy. Temüjin knew that consolidation required vigilance. The strength of the empire depended on constant care, foresight, and the cultivation of loyalty among men who had once been his foes. As night fell across the steppe, fires glimmering in distant valleys, Temüjin rode alone for a time beneath the stars. The endless sky mirrored his ambitions, vast and unyielding. He understood that the unification of tribes and kingdoms was only the foundation. The shaping of history required wisdom, courage, and the ability to govern justly and decisively. Yet he was ready. The empire was secure, the people bound by law and loyalty, and the Khan's vision stretched beyond the horizon, reaching toward the future he had long envisioned. The boy who had once survived frost and hunger had become a man whose name would endure through centuries. Temüjin had consolidated his power, united the steppe, subdued kingdoms, and created a framework for an empire that would be remembered forever. And as the wind swept across the plains, carrying the whispers of allegiance, awe, and respect, the Khan allowed himself a rare smile. The path was clear, the empire established, and the destiny of Genghis Khan had begun to take its place in history. The steppe had long since become a realm under the unyielding law of Temüjin, yet even as his banners flapped against the endless sky, the Khan understood that true mastery required more than conquest. It demanded vision, foresight, and the forging of loyalty into an unbreakable bond.
Temüjin rode at the head of his army, now seasoned beyond measure, men bound by oath and belief rather than fear alone. The experience of battles, sieges, alliances, and betrayals had honed them into a force that moved with the precision of a single organism. Every maneuver, every strategy, every campaign was executed with the care of a master artisan, each success reinforcing not only the empire's reach, but the loyalty of those who served it. The Khan's mind, ever vigilant, weighed every decision with meticulous care. Reports of unrest in distant provinces, whispers of dissent, and potential threats from rival kingdoms were analyzed and addressed before they could escalate. Temüjin understood that the strength of an empire lay as much in governance as in conquest, and he balanced discipline with fairness, power with law, and ambition with prudence. His rule was absolute, yet tempered with the wisdom born of hardship and survival. In the spring, campaigns were launched against distant fortresses that had long defied any single power. Temüjin's army advanced as a living tide, cavalry leading with speed, infantry holding flanks, and archers raining death with precise coordination. Every fortress captured, every leader subdued, was integrated into the empire, its warriors trained, and its resources woven into the growing web of control. The Khan's name spread far and wide, whispered by envoys, merchants, and spies alike. Temüjin, the unifier, the strategist, the inevitable. Barthay remained by his side, a guiding force amidst the turbulence of empire. Her counsel ensured that victory did not breed tyranny, and that the empire's laws were respected across diverse peoples. The integration of former enemies into the administration, the protection of loyal clans, and the careful management of conquered cities created stability and trust. Under her guidance, Temüjin transformed military dominance into enduring governance, ensuring that loyalty was earned and respected. As summer arrived, Temüjin turned his gaze to the horizon beyond the steppe, toward kingdoms that had long ruled with stone walls and rigid armies. His strategy was multifaceted. Spies and emissaries softened defenses. Diplomacy and intimidation prepared the path,
and forces moved with speed and coordination unmatched in history. Battles erupted with intensity, yet each engagement was carefully orchestrated. Victory was decisive, yet mercy and incorporation followed swiftly, reinforcing the legitimacy of his rule. By autumn, the foundations of an empire that would span continents were firmly in place. Temüjin was no longer merely a conqueror. He was a ruler of unprecedented authority, a unifier of peoples, and a visionary whose strategies ensured the survival and growth of his dominion. Tribes that had resisted now served willingly. Cities once hostile now thrived under his law, and the Khan's influence extended far beyond the steppe, touching lands and peoples who had never known his shadow.
Temüjin reflected on the boy who had survived exile and hunger, the man who had endured betrayal, and the leader who had turned chaos into order. Each hardship had been a lesson, each struggle a guide, each victory a foundation for the empire that now sprawled beneath his gaze. The steppe, once wild and fractured, had become a crucible in which a ruler of destiny had been forged. And as night fell over the vast plains, the stars overhead bearing witness, Temüjin allowed himself a rare recognition of triumph. The empire was unified, borders secured, and loyalty earned. The vision he had carried from boyhood, the survival of the steppe, the unity of clans, and the creation of a lasting legacy, was now tangible, embodied in law, military might, and the hearts of those who served him. The steppe lay calm under the morning sun, yet the tranquility belied the force that Temüjin had become. His armies, once scattered tribes, now moved as a single entity, disciplined, loyal, and formidable beyond measure. Every fortress, every city, every clan that had once resisted, now recognized the inevitability of his rule. Temüjin's vision, born in frost-bitten nights and exile, had matured into an empire whose shadow stretched across continents.
He rode among his banners, observing the men who had endured with him, the leaders who had pledged loyalty, and the peoples who now depended on his law. Each step of conquest, each campaign of strategy, each moment of governance had shaped him from a boy into a ruler of destiny. Temüjin knew that the strength of an empire rested not only in swords and horses, but in the hearts of those who served it. Loyalty, respect, and fear were instruments wielded in balance, and he mastered them all. Campaigns continued, pushing the borders farther, integrating kingdoms whose walls had seemed impregnable, and bringing law to lands long fractured by rival kings and clans. Temüjin's army moved with precision, striking where the enemy was weakest, exploiting divisions, and consolidating victories into lasting governance. Cities were secured, leaders incorporated, and the infrastructure of an enduring empire established. Berthe remained at his side, a constant guide and anchor. Her wisdom shaped the administration, ensuring that power was tempered with justice, and that conquered peoples could be allies rather than subjects. Temüjin listened, learned, and implemented systems of governance that would outlast his own lifetime, securing both peace and stability across the vast territories he now controlled. As the seasons turned, Temüjin's influence became undeniable. Tribes that had resisted were loyal. Kingdoms that had opposed him were integrated, and the shadow of his empire stretched beyond the steppe into regions never before touched by a single ruler. Envoys carried tales of his victories and fairness, and rival powers recognized both his strength and his inevitability. He was no longer simply Temüjin. He was the embodiment of destiny itself, a Khan whose name would echo through history.
In the quiet of night, beneath the endless sky, Temüjin reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the hunger and exile of boyhood, through betrayal, hardship, and relentless struggle, he had risen to command the steppe and the kingdoms beyond. Each hardship had forged wisdom, each victory had forged authority, and each challenge had forged the man who would become Genghis Khan. The final acts of consolidation required foresight, patience, and the unwavering application of law. Temüjin enforced justice consistently, rewarding merit, punishing treachery, and weaving diverse peoples into a single unified empire. His generals, trusted advisors, and loyal clans became the pillars of governance, and together they ensured that the empire was not only vast, but enduring. At the zenith of his power, Temüjin addressed his people, his voice carrying across the steppe and the cities alike, a proclamation of law, unity, and vision. The clans, the warriors, the citizens listened, understanding that the Khan's rule was absolute yet fair, that loyalty would be rewarded and betrayal punished, and that the empire they served was born of both strength and justice. And so the orphan who had survived frost, hunger, and betrayal had become the master of an empire that would span continents. Temüjin, now known as Genghis Khan, stood at the summit of destiny, a ruler whose vision, wisdom, and unyielding will had transformed chaos into order, division into unity, and survival into empire. The steppe, once wild and fractured, had become the foundation of history, and the name of Temüjin would echo across time as the architect of one of the greatest empires the world had ever known.
Beneath the eternal sky, the banners of the empire waved, the armies rested in discipline, and the Khan looked toward the horizon. The journey from boy to conqueror, from exile to ruler of empires, was complete. Yet, in that completion, Temüjin understood that history would remember not just the victories, but the vision, the laws, and the enduring unity he had forged. The rise of Genghis Khan was not merely a story of conquest. It was the birth of legend, eternal and unyielding, stretching across the steppe, across kingdoms, and into the annals of time.